Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today's episode is all about understanding complex trauma and how it impacts leaders and employees. In order to have this discussion, I've invited Clint Callahan. Clint is a seasoned social worker and licensed therapist who has more than 20 years of experience in the mental health field. Clint's experience also includes business management, case management, and mental health therapy. He works with diverse populations and has tackled a broad spectrum of issues such as military personnel trauma, psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, and much more. Welcome to the show, Clint.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, when I hear all that, I'm like, really? That's me? Or are you sure? I don't feel like I've done that much.
That's you. That's you. So I'd like to start by asking you because you have an amazing background, an amazing history. Can you start by telling our audience how your personal challenges, such as
Mhm.
being born premature, being bullied, having depression yourself, and being a child of a parent who committed suicide, led to you becoming a mental health therapist and servant leader?
Sure. So when I was born, I weighed 1 pound, 15 ounces. And so at the lowest weight, I think I got to 1 pound, 9 ounces. And that was 47 years ago. So they didn't know that you could hold premature babies and do those different things because they were always so afraid of, them not their everything being underdeveloped, right? So really the first 3 months, 4 months of my life was clinical touch. It wasn't being touched by people. It was being touched by people, but by doctors, where it was all clinical. It was surgeries, it was needle, blood draws, it was these kind of things. And I found a notes that my mom took when I was in the NICU in the back of my baby book. And it basically said, the thing that's hardest for me is when I reach in to try and touch him, he flinches away from me. So that was the beginning of my life, was trauma, was physical trauma. And so I didn't realize that that had any major impact on me until I was much older. When I got trained to do EMDR, I decided to be the guinea pig, and that's eye movement desensitization or reprocessing, and that's designed to help process trauma. And so I decided to be a guinea pig for the training to do this. And the reason why I did was because a couple of weeks earlier, my youngest, who's a very touchy-feely, tactile kid, came up behind me and hugged me, and it triggered that fight or flight response in me that I've always had, but to a point that it even scared me. So I went and did the EMDR processing. What I found was that it allowed me to break through, and it allowed me even to heal the trauma from when I was a baby, because it helped me to reprocess that the doctors weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to save my life, that all touch is not bad. And that's been kind of something that I've struggled with my entire life. And so that started the process of trauma. And then from there, I a miracle baby. That's what my parents always told me. And so that really made me think about myself in a different way. But then when I got into school, I was bullied a lot through middle school, elementary, middle, and high school. And that caused me to develop people pleasing, imposter syndrome, anxiety, depression. I had anxiety so bad when I was in elementary school that I would miss weeks and days and months of school. Like I would miss like almost 2 to 3 months of school every school year because I got so sick from that kind of that feeling of not knowing, can I trust the people around me?
Wow. Wow. Fascinating. So, as you know, this show is all about effective servant leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want you to kind of, for the audience, because everybody's heard about complex trauma, but not a lot of people know what it is. So, can you define or describe for the audience what is complex trauma?
I'd be happy to. So, complex trauma has a couple of different definitions, but the one that is most commonly understood is this is when you have multiple trauma events in your life that have either not been resolved or you have been struggling to resolve that compound each other. It basically is a compounding effect of trauma on how you interact with individuals, with yourself, and just with the world at large. And so when you have complex trauma, you're not just feeling like you're being attacked from one angle. You feel like you're being attacked from multiple angles at multiple times, which then makes you hyper aware, hyper alert, and keeps you in the biological fight or flight response state continuously, which then leads to what I consider to be systematic burnout, because that's what happens, because you're always in fight or flight. So then you don't really get a chance to relax. And because you don't get a chance to relax, your body stays in biological fight or flight. And there's the difference between, because everyone's heard of fight or flight. And one is the biological component, but the other component is the psychological component. And when those two things get together and they create this story of what's happening in your life, it creates this overwhelming just fear about everyday life, and that's one of the things that imposter syndrome is. It's one of the things that affects depression, anxiety. It affects your feeling of being a people pleaser in all these different ways. Burnout is kind of the umbrella under which a lot of this stuff lives, because it's so pervasive and it's so systematic.
So, how does the complex trauma impact or influence that person, and how do they show up in the world? How do they show up at work?
Sure. So at the workplace, think of it this way. So we all got that email from our boss, right? That says, "Hey, we need to talk." And the thing that happens when that happens is that immediately triggers your biological fight or flight response. Your heart starts to beat faster. Your mouth kind of dries out. You start to breathe really shallow, and you start to kind of get that sick feeling in your stomach. That's not just you being concerned. That's you going into fight or flight. And so what happens then is then the story starts coming in your brain, which says, this means that I'm probably in trouble. This means that I could lose my job. This means I could lose my livelihood. This means then I could lose everything I've worked for. This then means that I am now going to end up homeless, penniless, dead. And it escalates super fast, because biological fear for human beings is all about survival. So in that moment, the way you perceive that email is this very threat to your survival. And the problem with that is when you're in that state, you now begin to become aware of everybody and everything around you. Sounds sound louder. Time feels slower, because the way adrenaline works with the human brain is it speeds up your brain, but that makes time slow down. So 1 second now feels like 5 to 10 seconds. That's why when you're in anxiety, when you're in this fight or flight response, you sitting there and thinking about what's going to happen next feels like it must have been like 3 hours I was sitting here. And you look down your watch and it's like, oh, it's only been 3 minutes. How is that
Wow.
possible?
Wow. Interesting. So, how does complex trauma impact from a leader? So, put yourself in a
Mhm.
leader's shoes right now, because you are a leader, and so how does that affect your decision making processes when you're
Mhm.
dealing with staff?
Yeah. So, in a leadership position, the way complex trauma affects you is you have to remind yourself that the best way to describe it is this is how feelings work. So you have thoughts plus feelings, and then that equals the way you act. But because you're not doing it in a vacuum, there's always usually somebody at the other side of that action, which then they have thoughts and feelings, and then they react. And then that reaction creates a reaction in you, which then triggers thoughts plus feelings, which then creates another action or reaction. It creates this cycle, this loop that you get stuck in. And so if the story you're telling yourself is, I really don't want to talk to this person, I don't want to have to be the person that is going to bring down the hammer, or has to tell this person that they're fired, or has to tell this person that I have to give them corrective action, or that I'm concerned about them. I don't want to get into that. So the story for you becomes this fear-based response of, I don't know how they're going to respond to me. So because I don't know how they're going to respond to me, I now have to try to think 7 steps ahead of what they're going to do. But yet that's impossible, because there's literally an infinite amount of ways that a person could respond to however you're interacting with them. So you're trying to predict what's going to happen instead of just remaining present and being there and managing as you go what's happening in the moment. And that's one of the most effective ways to manage somebody, is to be present and to recognize what they're feeling, and to create and to do clarifying talk, to do reflective listening and active communication with people. Because by doing those two things, you're now creating that 100% communication model between the two of you as much as any two human beings can, in order to get them so that you know what they're saying, so that they know what you're saying, and so you both can reach this agreement or this consensus, instead of it being the usual communication, which is around 60% effective most times.
Wow. So what you're basically saying is that a leader who has complex trauma really needs therapy
Mm-hmm.
because there's that lack of self-awareness. You don't really understand what is happening, that you're in that flight or fight mode constantly, and you have to be aware of that so that you respond appropriately. Correct?
That is exactly correct, because it all comes from awareness. If you are not present and you know yourself and you recognize the warning signs in your body when you're getting into fight or flight mode, because what most people think of fight or flight, they always think of what your brain is telling you, and they think that's what comes first, but it's not. 80% of fight or flight comes from the neck down, comes from our body, because that is where we gather all the information from the world around us, is really from our body. But our body is designed for about 185,000 years ago, when we lived in small groups of 25 to 100 people. That software, hardware stuff in our brain has not been updated since then. That was the last major change that they could find in the fossil record, anthropologically speaking, for human beings. And so, because of that, we are still very much stuck in the 50,000 years ago way of feeling about the world, where everything is out to harm us physically. And because of that, that is what is causing the issues and the problems for people in today's world. Because even though logically we know that we shouldn't react in a physical way, physically it overpowers us, and then emotionally we get stuck in that cycle.
Very good. Excellent. So the reason why I decided to have this show and to bring you on, it was that I once had an employee who suffered from complex trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't recognize it when I hired her because it didn't show up until she needed an adjustment in her
Yep.
medication. And I realize now, and until I started working for a mental health organization, did I understand all about trauma, how it operates, and so on. So until she needed that, I did not recognize it. So my question to you is, how do employers or leaders recognize that employees may have been impacted by complex trauma?
Yeah.
And what are some of the signs? Obviously, no one can discriminate against someone who has a mental, illness problem. And of course, many do, and many are in the workplace. So
Yeah.
what are some of the signs, especially now after COVID? People have mental health issues that they don't even realize that they have. So, what are some of the signs that we might be able to see that somebody might be in crisis?
Mm-hmm. So one of the way you can decide, you can figure out if people are in crisis. So let's say you have to talk to an employee and you have to start corrective action with them. So the first thing that they will do is, when they come in, you can tell by the way they come in, because usually they're going to come in, they're going to seem fidgety, they're going to seem nervous, they're not going to really be able to look you in the eye. Or there's going to be the exact opposite. They're going to come in, they may be a little extra aggressive, they may have a little more posturing, they may be extra on edge. And these are things that you'll notice based on, because if you when you work with people long enough, you know what their regular body language is. So really the first thing you have to look at is, what is their body language? What's going on with them? And the first thing I would do is I would ask them, like, hey, I just want you to come in. I want you to know that this is not something that is going to cause you to lose your job. This is not something that I'm here to tell you you're fired. I'm here because I'm worried about you. I'm concerned about some of the things that I have seen, because the way that it works when you begin to get into this kind of burnout phase is, the first thing you see from your employees is, first thing they do is they start to disconnect during meetings. They start to disconnect from work functions. They start to disconnect from really the corporate culture that they're in. That's the first step sign that you'll see. Then the next thing you'll see is maybe their hygiene starts to slip a bit. Maybe they shave every other day. Maybe they wear the same clothes 2 or 3 times a week. Maybe they just kind of, they kind of start to smell a little bit because they're starting to not take care of themselves individually. And that's kind of the second phase of this burnout and this separation process that people are going through. And then the third thing that you'll start to see is they'll go through having issues with, you might hear some scuttlebutt around the office that they're having some trouble at home, or they're having some trouble with their kids, or they're having some personal trouble, or that they're disconnecting from their friends and they're not really as sociable. And then the fourth thing that happens is they really start to disconnect from work. And that's usually by the time that it's kind of brought to your attention, is that now they're aware. You're aware because it's starting to affect their work. It's starting to affect their productivity. It's starting to affect their ability to actually do the job effectively.
Interesting. Um, so what are some of the things that leaders or employers or supervisors should be careful not to do while
Mm-hmm.
they're managing employees who have complex trauma?
One of the hardest things to do is you're going to want to confront them directly, but confronting them directly can trigger their trauma and can actually make it where they won't hear anything you say. Where then after they're triggered, nothing you say will get through because all they will be caught up in that story in their head. I'm going to get fired. I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to end up losing everything. They're going to be stuck in survival mode. So when you start to see someone kind of disassociate a little bit, where they kind of get that kind of 1,000-yard stare, or they start to take that where you can tell that they're not really there, is ask them if they need to take a break. Ask them if they need some water, if they need something, if they need to just stop and just take a breath for a minute to help them kind of come back to reality. Because that's the thing, on both sides, you both need to be present in order to have an effective conversation with each other.
And so how do you treat personally in your practice? How do you treat trauma?
Mm-hmm. So I treat trauma with a variety of modalities. I work with people in a combination of, I use cognitive behavioral therapy. I also use EMDR, which I mentioned previously. And I also work with people. And the thing I love most about EMDR is it's not about having people re-experience their trauma. It's about helping them to create clinical disassociation from it so that they can reprocess it and make it so they don't feel like they're trapped in it. So they can recognize it for what it is trauma is something you survive. You
Mhm.
can use it to make you stronger and to be stronger if you can recognize that and understand that and begin to reprocess it because you survived it. So that's the thing that's most important in it. It's not about the event, it's about what you learn from it and what you can take forward from it in order to have a more healthy and fulfilling life.
Nice, very good. So what is the best advice you could give someone who is experiencing any form of complex trauma, or perhaps maybe they don't even know
Mhm.
how would you advise them in terms of trying to figure out whether or not they are experiencing it?
It all starts with awareness, and the most effective thing that I know is that I've taught people is how to do a simple 5-minute process where the first thing you do is you do box breathing, which is where you breathe in for 4, you hold for 4, you breathe out for 4, and then you hold empty for 4. And you do that 4 times. And what that does is it calms down the parasympathetic nervous system to break you out of the biological fight or flight. Then the next thing I would do is then write down your story. This is just for you. You don't have to share it with anybody. Write down what this is telling you. Take a minute, take 2 minutes just to literally write it out so you can then see it. Then go do some quick exercise. Literally shake it off. Literally go and take a walk. Do some quick push ups. Take a power walk. Do something to redistribute where the adrenaline is going in your body. And then go back and read what you wrote. If after that you still believe that, then you know that there's something that needs deeper look. But you can also do the same process again to try to continue to break that biological fight or flight response so that you can come back to being present.
Excellent. Would you recommend? I understand that there is an ACEs test anybody
Hmm.
can take on, you Google it. It's called ACEs,
Yes.
ACES. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you meet a standard, I think it's if you two or three of them or whatever, can be sort of diagnosed or not diagnosed, but at least
Hmm.
understand that you might be at risk for it, um, complex trauma. So,
Yes.
would you
The
advise that?
Yes, I would advise that because that's a good place. Again, that's insight, right? That's recognizing that there's something going on with me. And that's where it all begins. Because if you can't admit that to yourself, then how can you admit that to others? And if you can't admit that at all, then you can't you can't heal because it always comes back to if you can't own it, you can't fix it. That's ultimately what it comes back to. So you need to figure out a way to own it so you can begin the process of fixing it. And it's scary. And I know it's scary, especially when you get to that fourth phase of burnout. You already feel like there's so much on your plate that you just can't add another thing. But if you do and you choose to make this choice so that you can begin to heal, your life will get better. But the problem is you have to make the choice. Nobody can make it for you. Changing your job is not going to fix this. Not talking to people is not going to fix this. Drinking, doing drugs, doing anything to try and numb it is not going to fix this. The only things that fixes this is you actively changing the way you perceive it and changing the way you react and use your body and use your brain to change the story and to change how your body is reacting to the situation.
Um, Very good. So, can you explain? You have designed your own transformational coaching system, and how would you use that to help leaders or employees who are struggling with complex? And can you explain what that system is and
Sure.
how people can benefit from it?
I would love to. So, my program is called Small Changes, Big Impact. It's a system that helps people in 15 minutes a day learn how to recognize these different signs that are going on inside of them, and it gives them actionable tools that they can use in the moment. I think it's about a 14-week course, and there's about 30 different tools that I teach people in 15-minute increments, and then I do group calls during the week. And so what this is designed to help employers and employees to also understand the deeper, different ways that you psychologically and you physiologically interact with the world in order to beat burnout and to stop stress. And so every lesson is literally 15 minutes. So that and then each lesson has a worksheet that takes about 10 to 15 minutes to do. So you watch the lesson, you work on the worksheet, you practice the skills, and that's what you do. And it allows you to begin the process of changing the way you think about things. Because again, it all comes back to awareness. So if we can increase people's awareness of what's going on inside of them, then they will be able to interact with the world in a different way because they can then stop the story at any time and say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this anymore. This is not who I want to be. This is not how I want to act. So I need to change this in this moment right now.
So, how can people learn more about what you do and how to reach you, learn more about your coaching program and get in touch with you if they need to?
Sure. You can find me at smallchangesbigimpact.net /info. You can also find me on LinkedIn and you can look up my name, Clint Callahan. And you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram at Small Changes Big Impact, the number 4 and the letter U, dot the number 4, the letter U. And you can find me also, you can just look me up, Clint Callahan, LCSW, and you'll find me that way as well.
I think this information really needs to get out to employers as well, because I'm sure that they are confronting these issues, but not really recognizing, not understanding that that person is having mental health crisis or a mental health problem. I know they have resources, employees have resources, but a lot of times I think privacy is an issue. They don't want to share that perhaps with their employer. thinking that even though it is supposed to be private, that that fear of risking that might be a barrier to someone wanting to get help but not knowing how.
That is correct. You're exactly right.
So I thank you so much,
Thank
for
you for
the
having me.
valuable it was invaluable what you shared today. And I think it's really important for people to take a moment and think about that, and getting the help that they need. So thank you once again, and I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. And I would love to get to do this again sometime.
Absolutely.